Okay. So good evening, friends. Seems like our numbers have slightly dwindled, at least for our live class, but that's okay. I'm really happy for everyone who's here and everybody who's going to listen along later on. I hope you're doing well. I just want to honor rather than hiding it, that it's been quite a week and quite a day. Lots of good things happening personally, but things that take up quite a lot of time, and then lots of not so good things happening in the larger world. And those of you who are involved in the Shambhala community, I just want to honor that there was more revelations about misconduct in that community this week. And at some point, definitely want to participate further in discussions about that. And my desire is to be as transparent as I possibly can be. But I also want to honor that that's not the purpose of this course, particularly. The beauty of this course is it's a group of people getting together to actually study and practice Buddhist thought and the Dharma. So, but just wanted to honor that for some of us, myself included, that and other things might be in the space. And also want to honor that this is a full moon night, and in various Buddhist cultures, this is a good night to practice working with karma. Full moons are often related with purification, we could say, of karma. So it feels very auspicious, as the Tibetans like to say, that we are having our first of two classes on understanding karma on a full moon night. So we're going to start with our meditation practice, which I'm just going to lightly guide until we get to the last bit of it, where we will contemplate karma as we currently understand it. So I'm going to invite you to come into your favorite Zoom meditation position, the lotus of Zoom, which does not mean full lotus. Anyway, we're online, so even the 99% of us who cannot sit in full lotus, we could probably just develop a full lotus emoji. But I would like to ask you to bring your body into a comfortable seated position. Just start to find your seat and take a few moments to scan your body for alignment, upright but not uptight, grounded, open heart, broad collarbones, comfortable resting position for your hands, finding the gaze that most suits you at the start of practice. And then just check in. You could just ask yourself, how am I? Or this could be a moment to reflect on your intention for your practice in general. And the sound of the gong can begin to invite you into shamatha meditation, body breathing as an anchor, awareness, finding this warm but non-attached awareness that works with noticing when we are lost in thought and gently coming back. So we'll do that for about 10 minutes. So we'll just shift our meditation from shamatha to contemplating karma, which many of you have studied this before. Many of you have read the chapter in my book, The Road Home, or you've just heard about it, perhaps. But I just want you to contemplate that word, karma. So what do you know about that word? What does it mean? Or what does it not mean? So we're just going to take 2 or 3 minutes to contemplate our understanding or our definition or confused definitions we've heard of karma. And if you feel like you come to a clear, like Webster's definition, just note that. And if you don't have clarity, that's fine too, but just see if there's a clear sentence that describes karma for you. And then we can let this little contemplation and practice period go. Again, always beneficial to have a little moment of gratitude for your practice. You made it to your practice tonight. And if you'd like to close practice with a bow, please feel free. So I just want to leave a few minutes, and you don't have to participate, but I wanted to invite particularly people who haven't participated in our live exchanges before. If anybody wants to write your one sentence definition of karma, could be a sentence with a few commas in it, sure, semicolons, em dashes, but one sentence definition of karma, I want to just leave time for you to do that. And I won't comment on them right now. I'm just going to repeat them just to get a sense of what we're working with. And don't be afraid if you think it might be slightly off or way off. It's just a matter of sharing this really widely used term, what we think it means. Okay. So Emily wrote ongoing process. Keith wrote habitual patterns. Lorraine wrote the ways in which my present moment actions impact my future moment experiences. Oh, they're coming in fast now. Paul wrote the relationship of greed, hatred, and delusion to the effects of action, which either increase or decrease these forces in self and others. Amy wrote, you are born into it. Connie wrote, what goes around comes around. Hunt wrote, actions driven by intention. Dorian and Dutch both wrote almost simultaneously, cause and effect. Douglas wrote, I think a good modern psychological synonym would be learning. Grant wrote, habit energy, another cause and effect. From Sam, karma describes the problems that arise from dualistic thinking. Elisa. Susan wrote, an interrelated cycle of cause and effect. Carol wrote, karma, the habits and default attitudes we bring. Edna wrote, karma is the habitual pattern of thinking and taking a moment to discovering and noticing the gap. Christina wrote, the force of habitual patterns. Laura wrote, intentional actions have consequences. Melissa just wrote, movement. Ryan wrote, actions and the opportunity power that carries. Katie wrote, the ripples in the pond. Amy wrote, consequence. Erica wrote, cyclical actions and reactions. Dorian wrote, for every action, there's a reaction ripple effect. So this is awesome. I can already tell we're going to have a very lively interaction because that was by far the most interactive you've all been whenever we've asked for that. So at least in Tuesday nights. So the way I wanted to discuss this is, and I'm going to come back around to this, but I decided to shift a little bit. I'm really glad that we have 2 weeks to talk about karma, because we could just talk about that for 8 weeks. We could just talk about it with some repetition for the rest of our lives. But I decided to shift a little bit the way I was going to structure talking about it. And to be very simple, tonight, this 5th week of the class, I want to talk about karma as a relative truth. And next week, wanted to get more into depth into the 12 nidanas, which is the cyclical, very, very granular teaching on cycles of habitual patterns. But I also want to talk next week about sort of an ultimate truth perspective on karma. And to be very simple, because we're going to come back around and around again, this is a very important Buddhist philosophical framework of relative and ultimate truth. When we say relative truth, one overarching way to describe what we mean is in any relative truth, there is an interdependent or interlocking set of causes and conditions being investigated. So it's relative truth is specific to a particular framework of causes and conditions. For example, it's a full moon tonight, and that is specific to the vantage point that one perceives from, because tomorrow night it will not be a full moon. So full moon is actually a relative truth. It arises from specific causes and conditions. Ultimate truth has to do with looking into experience beyond the specificity of certain causes and conditions. No matter what is happening, ultimate truth is happening. And we'll revisit this. And the other thing is that I think what's going to start to happen as we move forward is we're going to start to see how teachings begin to refer back to each other. So we are going to, in our second course, pick up a lot of the themes that we begin this week and next week when we talk about a Buddhist philosophical system called the Chittamatra, or the mind-only system. And also when we talk about the 6 realms. So we're going to revisit karma a lot, which is not not meant to be a joke. But even if you're not going on to course 2, which I hope everybody is, you'll probably be working with this one a lot. It's so central to the experience that we're working with on the Buddhist path altogether, what we're working with in a subtle way or sometimes a hidden way in our meditation practice. And it's wonderful to explore this framework. Now, karma is also, I would say, one of the most misused terms that Buddhist thought or Eastern thought has produced. I would give it the silver medal for misused terms in Western advertising. Number 1 would definitely be Zen. I would, if I was a Zen teacher, I would just sue every advertising company in the United States for false representation. But number 2 is karma, for sure. And so it's really interesting to look at all the ways that karma is often talked about in our vernacular, or in kind of a more superficial glean of these teachings. And just to go through some of those views of karma, right? So again, what we're doing here from the Eightfold Path standpoint is clarifying the intention and the view with which we go forward into our practice and into our conduct in life. And so the way that I mostly understand karma, there's even different Buddhist philosophical systems related to karma, but the way that I understand karma comes from some of the earliest Buddhist teachings that the Buddha himself gave, like on the 12 nidanas. I think we all will be familiar with this word, but Nidanas. Oops. The 12 nidanas. And then the way that we experience karma and talk about the framework of karma comes from a system called the Chittamatra or Yogacara or mind-only school, which we're going to study more in depth in our second course, right? And so I just wanted to go through some of the ways that karma is understood, or in our vernacular, that may have some real confusion from a Buddhist standpoint. And I think the number one confusion that I hear, which is a little bit more often articulated, is that we're referring to some kind of secret currency, like whatever country you're in has currency. You have the dollar, you have the peso, you have, the euro. But karma is the sort of universe's currency. And I think a lot of people think of karma as like, if I do good things, I get a few coins, not in my pocket, but sort of in the universe owes me. I have my account, my credit account, right, with the universe. And then I think there are other ways of looking at karma. One is that it's fate. Sometimes people say, well, this awful thing happened to my friend. And you may have even heard a Buddhist teacher say something along these lines. And they say, in an attempt to comfort you, oh, that was their karma, right? As if it's like a destiny based on a destiny-based way of looking at our experience. You have karma as a boomerang, right? What goes around comes around. The view that like you yell at somebody, then you're going to immediately get splashed by a car driving through a huge puddle or something like that. Like some sort of whatever you throw out into the universe comes back and hits you, right? Now, all of these may map on to experiences we feel we've had, but I just wanted to call out sort of structurally what Buddhist thought, especially in the Yogacara system, says is happening is not quite these things. Although perhaps every once in a while a metaphor can be drawn from these views. The last view of karma that I really want to debunk, and I think it's important because I do think that a mistaken view of karma, both in the East and the West, where we don't historically have that word, can create a really a very unfortunate and malicious political argument, which is that the view is that whatever somebody's current situation in the world is, in terms of their level of privilege or well-being or respect or success, that it is their karma, right? So there's an assumption that there's something spiritually better about those who have better life circumstances, right? And so I like to think of this as the spiritual libertarian approach to karma. And I think it's incredibly important, again, from the life of the Buddha, that he was born actually into such a system where people were separated into castes based on sort of what was viewed as their spiritual well-being or their spiritual prowess, and you could not change your caste. And we don't exactly have a spiritual caste system, but we do have we don't really have much of a spiritual system in the Western world these days, at least not a coherent one. And we do have a caste system, right? So the notion that if a person's a billionaire, they must have done all the karmic things themselves with no help from others to get there. I don't think the Buddha would agree with that statement, right? So this notion of sort of whatever your experience in life is, you caused it, and that's karma. We can see how that would be a very politically individualistic approach to karma. Now, the interesting balance to hold when studying karma is, and this is the hard balance to hold, the study of karma historically is an individual psychology. And what I mean by that is it's about looking at our personal perception, our personal experience, our personal history, our personal intention, and how a cycle of experience functions, right? And the Buddha was, his mapping of the mind really focused primarily on the level of individual consciousness. And so the historical teachings of karma do focus on the cycles of individual consciousness. But that does not mean that they're saying that individual consciousness isn't affected by cultural, familial, interpersonal, social, political, racial, economic, gender, all of the factors, right? It's just looking at the individual mind as a cyclical experience and looking at how suffering or awakening work in relationship to those cycles. So the word karma literally means something like action. One way that I've often described it is, the science of physics, for example, is the study of the laws of cause and effect in the physical universe. F equals ma, force equals mass times acceleration. That's the only thing I remember from my high school AP physics class, but I do remember that. If anybody remembers more, please type in all the equations that you know. E equals mc squared. So there's a sense of the physical universe there. Karma, I think you could say, is the study of cause and effect in the mental universe. So how action happens in the mental universe. Which you could say, is that really distinct from the physical universe? And this is one interesting point that we're going to come back to, is modern day scientific materialists seem to think or argue, without really a lot of proof, if any proof, that the mental universe is just a subset of the physical universe. Here's the really interesting thing about Buddhist philosophy, especially the tradition called the Yogacara or mind-only tradition. They flipped it. They argued that the physical universe is an outgrowth of the mental universe. In other words, if you want to understand how the physical universe works, you have to understand how the mental universe works, which is different from a lot of biologists these days who are want to study chemistry and neurology and then say that is those physical rules are what gives rise to consciousness. So who knows, right? But we are moving deeper into the study of our mental universe as an individual. But what I want to say is, just because we're studying individual consciousness doesn't mean that it's coming from a worldview where all cause and effect is individualistic. Because the other aspect of Buddhist teachings is there's nothing that no individual does anything without a wide array of external factors influencing them. So I hope that all makes sense. And if it doesn't, I'm happy to clarify. So what do I think is a good definition of karma? There's a word in Sanskrit, bija, which in Tibetan is a word pakchak. And this word, my understanding when translated into English, the way Chogyam Trungpa translated it in the Shambhala teachings, it translates as habitual pattern. Thich Nhat Hanh, one of my favorite teachers, likes to use the phrase habit energy. I've heard bija translated as karmic seed, but there's a sense of some habitual momentum to the mind, forces already at play. And in terms of the relative truth of karma, as we get deeper into the teachings on karma, the relative truth at play is the interrelationship between past, present, and future within one individual's consciousness. So this is a really interesting psychological question that's come up a lot when Buddhist thought is paired with or compared with a lot of the time Western psychological frameworks. How much does the past matter? Right? That's a great question. How much does the past matter? Have you asked yourself this question? Right. So there is this notion, and a lot of people, I think the Western psychologies continue to evolve just as much as Buddhist thought in the West continues to evolve. But a lot of people who came to Buddhism maybe in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, if they had studied or practiced psychodynamic or psychoanalytic ideas where you talk a lot about your developmental past and learn more about it, one of the things that seemed unique about Buddhism is that there seems to be a focus on the present moment experience, right? And that's true. All of our meditative techniques, with the exception maybe of contemplation and reflection, are about working with the present moment manifestation. But the 12 Nidanas, as we get into it next week, is going to very clearly state that the present is always built upon past karmic formations. So large bodies of bijas, you could say, are called samskaras. And this is the word that sometimes gets translated as karmic formation. It's almost like if a bija is a individual karmic seed, so an individual habitual pattern. Then what a samskara is, it's like if you go into like your grocery store, not every grocery store has this, like or your health food store. You know how in health food stores they have the different grains in the different glass or plastic holders? And bulk foods. Thank you, Laura. Yeah, the bulk food section, and you can pull the mask up and drop a bunch of organic quinoa or oats or whatever it is into your plastic bag. So if each individual grain is a bija, is a habitual pattern, then the containers of a whole type of grain would be called the samskaras. Right? So all of the different habitual patterns associated with sarcasm, the sarcasm bulk. And so when we get into the nidanas, the past, understanding habitual patterns and types of karmic formations becomes actually quite important in Buddhist thought. I think sometimes when people say that Buddhist thought and Buddhist teachings don't focus at all on the past, one, they're missing the importance of lineage, and two, I often want to say, go back and study the 12 nidanas, the teachings on karma, because the past is important to reflect on. But what's important, most important, is that there's this sense that karma delivers a kind of habit energy from the past into the present moment. So I like just that notion of karma as mental momentum. That's my right now, this week in preparing for this class. That was the way I was contemplating and studying. I was like, habit energy, habitual patterns, mental momentum, right? Sometimes they're called the winds of karma, you know, and depending on the direction the winds are blowing, anybody who flies cross country in North America, which I do fairly regularly or used to, the winds are strong, and it does seem like they're getting stronger. I don't know if that's just my climate change paranoia or what, but have you noticed that flying from east to west coast, going east to west takes like literally 2 hours longer than west to east? So there's a real, it's interesting, and I like this notion of winds or mental momentum because wind is invisible. You know, it's a force that's sort of invisible, you know. When you get blown by a wind, there's literally this feeling of like, where is that force coming from? You know, it's like an invisible giant, like waving a fan down the block and just picking off us little humans. You know, it feels sort of sourceless. You know, you can't name it in the physical world, and that is a way to think about karma. Is this like mental momentum? It's like you arrive at a party and you meet this person and you don't know why, but you just are blown away from this person. It's like that person is really irritating. And the good Buddhist in you, if you identify that way, or the good mindful person in you starts to feel judgment because you're like, I don't want to be averse to that person. Has anybody ever felt that way? Like just this sort of like, I don't know why that's irritating. And there's a sense that there's a hidden momentum from the past that's carrying you into the present moment. Now, it could be useful at that point to do a little bit of developmental analysis, like, do they have the same jawbone as your first love or something like that? But the key point here is that we never arrive until complete enlightenment, is what they say. We never arrive in the present moment free of any momentum. There are always momentums. The other way I like to think about karma for social media fans is the filter, right? So those of you who are on, like, for example, Facebook or Instagram, and you share pictures, you take a picture, but there is a lot that you can do in this digital era. And my wife and various friends went to school for photography, so they actually know what photography is. I just like choose the filter and change the lighting a little bit and act like I did something, you know. But you can really make image look completely different based on the filter. It's still the same material, but it's received and perceived in such a different way. Right? So starting to look at these filters and these modes of momentum that carry us into the present moment is the study of karma. Now, when we talk about the past, as we get into next week, the 12 nidanas, and I just want to address this because this will also come up in our second course when we talk about the 6 realms. I want to address the possibility of looking at multiple lifetimes, because the cycle of karma really could just be talking about, like, it could be talking about any length of time, right? It could be talking about, there could be a cycle of karma that's 10 seconds, you know? That is one of the things about our device era, like when you have your smartphone, is the cycle between past conditioning and momentum and how you choose to respond to that notification coming up on your screen is very quick, right? So past, present, and future, a complete cycle could be a few seconds, or we could talk, to go back into that developmental space, we could talk about the relationship between our early past, our present, and the future as we grow older in this lifetime. Usually when the 12 nidanas was taught, past, present, and future were actually described, my understanding, as lifetime 1, lifetime 2, and lifetime 3. So this makes it a little bit more mystical, right? What I've thought is there's so many ways to think about multiple lifetimes. And again, you don't have to believe in anything. I'm not sure what I believe. I think I do believe in some form of reincarnation. I definitely believe that there will be future generations of sentient beings and humans who reincarnate and have access to an awakened and compassionate world, and that's somehow related to what happens in this time around. So I believe in a kind of generational reincarnation. So we could, the same way they look now at intergenerational trauma, we could look at it as like intergenerational karma. And maybe the wisdom of multiple lifetimes is just looking at sort of what we pass along to future generations. But if you start to believe this view of the world where the mind is not a product of the physical world, but the physical world is a product of the mind, then it becomes a lot easier to see why multiple iterations of consciousness or a conscious stream might produce themselves over different physical embodiments or different types of embodiments. So I just want to throw that in because I think that teachings on karma work any way that you want, but in the earliest suttas, as well as in the Tibetan system, the notion of multiple lifetimes as a sort of aspect of one's Dharma practice were part of the view. So I just wanted to throw that in. So last big bunch of topics that I want to introduce for tonight. You could say, are we trying to end all karma, or are we trying to get good karma? Get good karma. See how I went back into the capitalist currency? It's so pervasive, isn't it? The notion of accumulation rather than experiencing. So it's an interesting question, right? Are we trying to end our karma, or are we trying to gather or generate more positive karma and lessen negative karma? So I want to talk about this. This is where we'll come back next week into the relative and ultimate truths. On the level of relative truth, what we are trying to do, I think Meredith described well in terms of the teaching on the four types of right effort, which are all about relative truth approach to karma. So the notion on the relative level is you're going to plant some seeds, and some seeds bear fruit, and some seeds are malicious weeds that cause further harm, right? So on this relative level, a lot of our practice is actually, and there are some ideas recently in the Western lexicon about like how long it takes to establish a good habit, right? Or how long it takes to get out of a bad habit. What do we mean by good and bad? I think it's incredibly important to be clear what you mean by good and bad. Because otherwise we get into this habit of really thinking that like we're good people if we're doing certain things, and we are literally bad people if we are doing other things. And so good here's a better word for good. The word in Sanskrit and Pali is kushala, Kusala. And the other word is, which is just its negation, is akusala, Akusala, to totally transliterate them. And you hear different translations of this, and maybe you've heard different ones. The ones that I hear most often into English are good and bad karma, which I don't really like. One that you hear very commonly, especially from Tibetan teachers, is virtuous and non-virtuous. Some of the insight teachers I really like use my favorite translation, which is wholesome and unwholesome. And maybe an even better translation is healthy and unhealthy, or helpful and harmful. So there are certain habitual patterns that we could get into based on our past, based on how we work in the present, and based on how that leads us into the future, that are very much habitual patterns. But they create a sense of health, Like, let's say that you practice yoga every day, and your yoga practice starts to run on habit energy. Does anybody ever in your yoga practice? I do. Sometimes tune out a little because you have the sequence of movements and poses, and part of you is tuning out because it's just kind of boring, uncomfortable. You have to really engage. You have to really struggle to make it work. And so your body and mind maybe goes on autopilot for a little while. Does anybody ever do that in your meditation practice? Just kind of let the habit energy take over. It's not spontaneous presence or insight. And so these could be examples. I'm not going to promote meditation and yoga too much because maybe they are harmful too. I could think of sometimes maybe when practicing meditation is not helpful, Yes, while driving, maybe not helpful. Oh, you go into autopilot while driving. That's what Heather is saying. So even though in something like meditation or yoga, there's a sense of autopilot sometimes, and you're using habit energy, right? There's a momentum to the mind there's not a sense of awareness, presence, or clear insight. There's still an establishing of the pattern that's basically healthy. Yes. And Karen is saying past trauma is sometimes not helped with sitting meditation. That's incredibly important. The notion that when you're facing trauma, again, meditation is only one of the practices here. And so here's an example of meditation not being helpful. Let's say you're studying with a teacher and you say that you've been really harmed by something and want to contemplate it and maybe want to talk to the person who you feel harmed you. And the teacher says, like, I want you to go, you should go sit with that, right? I've heard so many stories at this point of teachers telling students, meditation teachers, go sit with that, when perhaps that is not the right habitual practice to re-enter at that moment. But back to our point, which is virtuous karma, there's a general sense of creating positive well-being, holding the door open. I really try to hold the door open for people. Sometimes I don't even look at who's coming in. I'm on autopilot. It's just sort of, maybe I'm doing it with an egoic, like, I want to be a good Buddhist person. Maybe I'm even doing it because I still believe that the universe is holding my credit score, and who knows? I could be wrong. Maybe the universe was created on completely capitalistic principles. And if that's the case, let me just hold this door open and just get a few more coins in the purse. Right? But even with that view, it does establish, it establishes more health and well-being for myself and for others than if my view was, I'm going to slam the door in people's faces. Because you know what? People should open their own goddamn door. Right? You can see if somebody has that view and that intention and then conducts that action, that it's going to establish a mental momentum that's aggressive, right? That the next time we cycle around, the karmic experience might be more angry and aggressive. The wind that blows them into the next moment is more negative, is more harmful, is more stressed, is more scared, right? So say, and I do think, it's interesting because I do think there is a benefit for Buddhist practitioners to like try some of the things that like I notice, because I have family in the South, that every time I go to the South, there's like certain superficial acts of karma are better achieved culturally there, like just being polite, like calling people sir and ma'am, is achieved in the South more. And sure, maybe it's covering more layers of, for some people, non-presence. But there is something to be said for just the desire to generate virtuous karma, just because it helps everybody feel just a little more at ease and a little bit more respected, if only on a superficial level, right? So part of our practice on the relative level is to actually study virtuous karma and not judge ourselves for not having it, but saying, exactly as the 4 efforts, the right effort teachings say, is there something I can do to give more momentum to the wind of virtuous karma? And is there something I can do to give birth, to start, and it's always harder at the start, even if our inspiration is stronger at the start. That's the interesting thing about beginning new practices, is it's harder to get the positive momentum going at the start, but your intention tends to be more excited and inspired, right? So there's a bit of a trade-off, but can I start a good pattern, right? So I don't know which you find is easier for you in something like meditation. Is it easier to come back to it when you've lost the habitual pattern of meditating regularly? Or is it easier to sustain and further when you have a little bit of a good thing going? It's an interesting question, right? And then on the flip side, there's a little bit of a quality of negative karma that there's like a mindful damage control going on, right? Like, could I just wait like 5 minutes before I send this angry email? Let me show it to one person, right? Could I just pause? Could I just lay off the harmful pattern? And then also this notion of, if there are influences in my world that cause me to begin that which I know will become a negative pattern, give that momentum, can I lay off of that? And I do, again, these teachings that we are talking about within the Tibetan framework, again, this whole body of first teachings is called the Hinayana, or the self-focused body of teachings. Classically, the recipe for practice in the world really did have to do with restraint from actions which were known to cause negative karma, or unwholesome karma, right? So refraining from, in classic teachings, even for a lay practitioner, refraining from alcoholic substances, for example. Now, one of the things that evolves when you really look is habitual patterns are not necessarily related to the object, or they're not necessarily caused by the object, right? And again, this worldview is saying that the mind is what's actually creating and generating and regenerating cyclically habitual patterns. But there are certain objects which we can get into negative karmic patterns with. I am convinced, and I'm going to grab it, I am completely convinced that if the Buddha were teaching now, one of the precepts would involve the smartphones, right? That doesn't mean the smartphone's bad. It just means that this tends to be that if you walk down a street in one of our cities, you will see people creating some kind of negative karma, even if it's just the modest negative karma of distraction and avoidance of awkward present moments. You will tend to see that, right? So what I would say is that if we wanted to practice in the classic Hinayana flavor at some point this week, we could really work with, is there something light? I wouldn't go into our heaviest patterns. And if you have addictive behaviors, you're already working, I'm going to assume you're already working with those in the way that is the most useful and compassionate for you. But if there's some little light negative karma that you could work with, trying to not engage in the momentum of, trying to actually notice the seeds, and not further water the seeds, not reproduce those seeds, that would be a really interesting way to understand this feeling of being blown, right? So the karmic winds there, you just grab this thing. my dad's texting me because it's his birthday today. And so they also help you connect with people you love, right? So there's a virtuous karma element to everything too. You know, there could be a virtuous karma element to sharing a drink joyously with people that you care for, and that is oftentimes my experience with alcohol, for example. But what we're really trying to play with is this momentum towards a negative cycle, and how invisible that is and how subtle it can be. So I would just say choose a light addictive pattern, a light negative karmic pattern that you have. And I think the phone could be a good one because it's so universal. And find a way to see if you can feel the habit momentum and not respond to it. And if you're taking this course because you just want to learn how karma works and you never want to actually work with your own karma, that's fine too. They actually say in the Tibetan system, they say even hearing these ideas plants positive seeds, you know, in the consciousness. And they also would say that for all of us, just to get into the multi-lifetime approach to karma, they also would say that if you are here now studying the Dharma, then seeds must have been planted in a previous lifetime that are now sort of coming to fruition in this lifetime. I don't know, but it doesn't not make sense. Nobody's ever explained to me coherently why that doesn't make sense. So I think I'm going to leave it at that for the lecture portion of tonight and open it up to some discussion about different views of karma or your own experience with karma. And then next week, we're really going to go into the cycle of the 12 nidanas and so forth. So I think you should be able to turn on your mic, or if you want to share a question on the chat, I can read it there as well. And just remember again this principle, and it's really up to you, of stepping up, stepping back. And it's not meant to chastise anyone for being excited about participating. It's just noticing that the social and the personal momentum around what our tendency is in terms of wanting to participate or hesitancy to participate. So Paul is saying that would it be safe to say that any absolute karma, well, there's no such thing as absolute karma, but we are going to look at karma from the framework of absolute truth, is not impermanent. So absolute truth, and this is going to annoy you probably, but what they would probably say is absolute truth is neither impermanent nor not impermanent. Put that in your iPhone app and stare at it. So the other question is about the more complex and a little bit esoteric piece in Chogyam Trungpa's book, Truth of Suffering and Path of Liberation, which he gets into this body of teachings, which is very esoteric, called the 5 paths, where this is a harder to understand. The 5 paths is a harder to understand set of teachings, but it's about sort of the stages of the journey to complete awakening. And you're absolutely right, Paul, that one of these is translated the path of accumulation. And accumulation, especially in the Tibetan system, is related to the accumulation of merit. Now, here's the really interesting thing. Merit does seem to be like a sense of your currency, your dharmic currency. Like if you practice, you, as the Tibetans say, you accumulate merit. You gather into your mental being a kind of beneficial resource that then leads you closer to the path of awakening. So there is a little bit of kind of I can't tell, Paul, if it's when the Tibetans talk about accumulating merit, they are talking about, or sometimes it's talked about as the two accumulations of merit and virtue, if they are talking about if they're co-opting the language of materialistic language or more consumeristic language, because that is part of our world, to make people enticed to want to do positive karmic actions. The other way of thinking about this is that merit and the accumulation of merit, or the gathering of merit, which I don't know why the gathering of merit is sounds less materialistic to me than accumulating, since they're mostly synonymous. But the other way to think about merit is that merit is sort of when we do engage in positive actions, there is a sense of there being some response from the outer world, right? It's just like if you're the friend who does call all their friends on their birthday. I have one friend from elementary school, Buddha bless her, Megan June, who still texts all of her elementary and junior high school friends on their birthday. She still remembers friends' birthdays from 7th and 8th grade. Now that creates merit for her in the sense of like anytime one of her friends thinks of her, they're going to go, oh, Megan, you know, it just creates a kind of residue in the outer world around you. So merit, I think, could be thought of as the external corollary of karma. Here's the thing about merit, though. If we get too materialistic about it, it turns into like this view of like the universe owes me something, you know, or I did this thing for you. I called you on your birthday and we haven't gone to school in 30 years together. Why didn't you call me on my birthday, right? It can turn into a kind of transactional thing. Whereas I think virtue refers to the internal space of karma, how the mind is reconditioned. And the other aspect of Tibetan practices, and this is confusing Paul and others, is even though they talk about accumulating merit, you also end every practice session by ceremonially dedicating all the merit that you've accumulated in that practice session to all beings. And I think as we go forward, we will start, for those of us who would like to, practicing dedicating the merit at the end of classes. So it's not really, it's interesting to think about as the accumulation of merit just to give it away again. But I do think there's something to merit being like that there actually is some kind of cause and effect to being a practitioner of mindfulness, compassion, etc. And it's not a like what it's not a one-to-one causality. Perhaps that's what's wrong with the what goes around comes around approach, the boomerang approach to karma, is that causality is quite complex and interwoven, but it never hurts to generate positive karma in relationship to other beings, you know, because there's nobody who's going to think that Megan is anything other than awesome for remembering their birthday 30 years later. So the question, are we trying to end all karma or get good karma? I want to save that one for next week. if that's okay. Christina asks, is there such a thing as collective or social karma? So I think this is incredibly important because the historical Buddha did not talk and did not develop a framework for looking at karmic cause and effect, meaning mental cause and effect, on a social or shared level. But it's very clear that he thought those things existed, which is why he focused so much on Sangha, so much on his Sangha or community reinterpreting the caste system. So there was definitely this implicit notion of karma not just being a personal psychological exploration, but it also being a social exploration. And so what I'll say is it's definitely there implicitly, and a lot of the modern Buddhist thinkers are really looking at the way Western thought in the 20th and 21st century has started to look at much more in depth at how social experience and social conditioning affects the seeds planted in individual consciousnesses of people within that particular group, you could say, right? So I do think we could say very clearly that it's Buddhist to say that there is karma of being a New Yorker, or karma of being a woman or female-bodied person, or karma of being a transgendered person, that it's going to affect the seeds of one's individual consciousness, or all of the different kinds of social groups that share some experience that affects them and perhaps affects them painfully. Nobody in Buddhist terms has developed a clear model the same way they've developed really clear models of individual consciousness and really clear models of individual cycles of karma. Nobody in Buddhist terms has developed a really clear model of what social karma would look like as a causal system. It would get really complicated, even with the one frame of reference of the individual cycle of karma, you already have 12 elements. So then bring a group, if you bring a group of 100 people together who share a certain identity matrix in our society, I imagine that the not to nerd out, but the framework would have to be like an 100th dimension version of like the 12 to the 100th power nidanas, right? Some people have done, and I tried to do this a little bit in the last section of the road home, looking at the three poisons, which we'll get into more and more: passion, aggression, and ignorance, looking at those as social phenomenon, not just individual phenomenon. So Douglas is adding to this, saying that is white privilege a kind of social karma, or is any oppressed group a kind of social karma? And I think you would say yes. And this is where I think Buddhist thought gets very interesting because, and we'll get into this in the second course, there are certain realms of shared experience, like in classic Buddhism, they talk about the jealous God realm and the God realm, where the experience is one of great privilege. In this, when we say privilege in Buddhist terms, usually we're talking about pleasure or comfort, right? A lot of times I find in the modern conversation of karmic privilege, we're talking about like safety and voice and agency. So in classic Buddhist terms, a lot of times these higher realms would be defined as higher because the previously generated karma had moved that consciousness into this realm of pleasure or this realm of some kind of power or comfort. The interesting thing from the Buddhist standpoint is the gods are often more confused than the humans, right? The privileged are often more confused. And I think that's a good doorway into something about modern conversations. But I think there's definitely, it has to be said that there is social and collective karma. There are social winds that blow. It's just nobody's developed a really clear Buddhist framework for how to investigate that. And I think that's the era that we're in Buddhist thought. So lost my place in the chat windows. Yes, and Amy's saying, would you say that there'd be some collective karmic momentum by the efforts of us all practicing together? It is considered that group merit, there's a kind of multiplying effect. And also, I mean, I think not to be policing anybody, but those of you who are thinking about giving the quads another try, I also really feel like investing a little more effort in the quads. Some of you, plenty of effort in the quads. You're doing great. And some of you are not connecting with it, but I do think we will find that there is a group momentum, right? And this is also related to, we're going to talk about this, the notion of enlightened society is the idea of a world where the group momentum, and this is currently hard for me to say as a Shambhala practitioner, but the idea still holds very clearly. And I do think someday some group of people is definitely going to do this. And I would like to reincarnate to be part of that group. That the sense of an enlightened community is one where the general momentum tends to push people closer towards experiencing their Buddha nature, their basic goodness, their innate wisdom, and so forth. So there are social momentums here, and Asanga has a really strong social momentum, and this is starting to be seen a lot psychologically too. That social environments really make it easier to practice. Yeah, so Michael is saying, is karma both how we experience the past, present, and future, or how we react habitually to the past, present, and future, or is it both? I think here's the thing about past, present, and future. The present moment is a future past and a past future, right? So the cycle of the 12 nidanas, don't ask me to repeat that. Just listen to the recording if you didn't get it. The cycle of the nidanas is talking about how the whole thing works together. So it's both about how the past brings us into an experience of the present moment, how we have an experience of the present moment, and then how our mode of reacting to the present moment moves us, gives us momentum, or pushes us or blows us into the future experience. So it's about all of it, to make that simple. So Sam's asking, what would you say about teachers like Reggie Ray, saying that there are no coincidences and all current experiences caused by past karma? Yeah, I mean, I don't know if anybody else has this experience, but I was noting with my wife when we were walking around our neighborhood this weekend that I have a few friends and acquaintances who live in our neighborhood who I always run into on the street. I mean, like ridiculous amounts of times that I run into certain people. And then I have other people I know who live in the neighborhood who I never run into. Does anybody else have this experience that there's people you always run into, and then there's people you're like, oh, you live a block from me, or you live close by and I never see you, or, you know, so is that coincidence? Is that you're somehow karmically linked to that person? Are you just karmically linked to their schedule? You know, I have no idea. I really have no idea. I agree that the notion of coincidence from a scientific standpoint, I mean that from a like how the, not Western science, but from a like scientific standpoint, the notion of coincidence just means that we don't understand the complexity of causes and conditions that bring a moment into being. And the notion of there is no such thing as coincidence could just be that we don't fully understand the set of causes and conditions and the different winds that blow different elements of a moment into being. So I would agree with Reggie Ray's statement that from that standpoint, there are no coincidences. But the other side of it is it's said actually that the only type of being who can fully understand the complexity of causes and conditions, who can see, to nerd out with movie selections again, who can see the entire matrix. The only being who can do that is a fully awakened Buddha, right? So I think the notion of coincidence or auspicious coincidence is useful, just in the sense of like, there must be some connection here. And because this is happening, is there a way to include it in my experience and in my practice? Another little piece of that, karmically, in terms of karmic connection to other beings, one of the things that I've heard Tibetan lamas say is, if you want to understand your karmic connection to another being or another person from a previous lifetime, what you have to look at is the intensity of your feelings about them. So if you are intensely drawn to another person, or you're intensely repelled by another person, either way, it means you have a strong karmic connection. I've heard multiple Tibetan lamas say that. Like, if somebody really bugs you and you don't know why, it means you have a strong karmic connection to them. Now, is this just the Tibetan lamas trying to get us to practice compassion for the difficult person? Well, we'll talk a lot about that in our third course, and maybe our second course too. But your guess is as good as mine on that one. But I agree, maybe there are no coincidences. So rebirth versus reincarnation. Yeah, and Dara's pointing out that in Road Home, talk about multiple, rather than talking about multiple lifetimes, use the phrase cycles of consciousness. Now you have to understand, part of me is just trying to make this accessible to people who don't believe in a kind of spiritual view of the universe that Buddhist thought is originally coming from, right? So saying something like cycles of consciousness rather than reincarnation might help facilitate a more psychological or accessible experience of these things. But if we start to take this view that the physical universe is a product of mind rather than the other way around, and I will say that the world, I will argue that scientific materialism does not actually make as much sense as psychological materialism or mind creating the physical world. If we start to take this view, then reincarnation, rather than it being like the rebirth of different bodies, it is actually different cycles of consciousness. And the reason I like that view is you can also look at, I mean, this is physically true, that actually, I can't remember how many years, but we only have a few types of cells that aren't regenerating constantly. So literally every number of years, I can't remember if it's 7 or something like that, but our physical body is entirely new material. So there is, even within this lifetime, some aspect of rebirth or what is it actually that creates the momentum that connects those two. So cycles of consciousness rather than rebirth or reincarnation. So to me, in my mind, rebirth and reincarnation are a little bit synonymous. So I don't know how I would distinguish between those two, but I do like the term cycles of consciousness, and I think uh, some people might think that that's getting away with a little bit of an over psychologizing or an over secularizing of a tradition that is actually meant to be more mystical and than that. Like the notion of like actually a kind of like reincarnation is more of a spiritual or even religious belief. Um, uh, but I think it works. And I think it works from the standpoint of looking at karma, that we are looking at one cycle of consciousness, which could be as short as 10 seconds when you're dealing with something like a smartphone or a cigarette, or it could be early life, uh, later in life, even later in life, or it could be lifetime A, lifetime B, lifetime C. Yeah. So in terms of the different realms of consciousness, we're gonna go deep into that in our second course. Um, but there's not uh, they all have problems. I'm looking at Hilder's comment on this notion of the human realm being higher than the animal realm, and uh, I do agree that there's some anthropomorphizing going on there, but actually, all of the realms of experience have their issues. So we'll definitely come back to that question and that topic. Okay, is this enough to chew on for a moment? Is this too much to chew on? Well, chew slowly. None of this has an expiration date. That's the good thing about Dharma and recording the Dharma, is it's more like jerky than anything else. It doesn't. It's not like an avocado that's going to go bad by tomorrow, and you have to savor every moment of it. It's we can revisit this, and each time we revisit it, there's more experience and more understanding. Again, these cycles of hearing, contemplating, meditating, this cycle of the three trainings or the Eightfold Path of study and practice and action in the world. So each time around the cycle, we hear a little bit more, and it's this constant experience for those of us who are practitioners of studying something or reading something that we've studied a bunch of times before, and you're like, I didn't know that was there the last time. So if you feel like you're biting off more than you can chew, there's no expiration date on finishing this meal. And sometimes it's good to just say, I'm just going to focus on a little bit. So in the interest of that, I would love for us to uh, close with a little bit of meditation together. To let this settle. So we can come back into our body. Take your seat. And for a few minutes, we can just find the breath, just to let what's in our head and maybe in our heart settle down a little bit into our base and our belly, coming back to our bodies and the breath. And then I invite each of you to think about, for the next week, one karmic habit that you'd like to just investigate. And again, let's not take this time to work with our most entrenched or painful habit, which is why I brought up the phone. It could be something that involves an object, which makes our relationship to this habit clearer, and something that manifests as a light negative pattern, such as distraction, rather than thinking of greater harms like addiction or abuse or something like that. And if nothing comes to mind, then you can just reconnect with your desire to generate the healthy or wholesome habit of meditation practice. And also like to remind ourselves that there's not really a sense of good or bad here. It's really just a chance to study how habitual momentum works and this interrelationship between past, present, and future. So whatever our experience this week is with practice or with some karmic behavior, it's just a chance to gain further insight into the way our mind works. And with that attitude, we can bring our practice to a close. And then again, for those of us who would like to make a commitment to the 7-day to daily practice, and this is useful for you to make this commitment, we'll do that together. I think because there's a slight delay, I will just read it one line at a time, and then if you want to repeat, you can read that line again. And I'll just read the explanation of the vow before we take the vow. The taking of this vow creates a tangible memory in the mind of the person speaking it. The mind of the vow taker is tethered to the flagpole of their commitment, bound only by an elastic cord of awareness. Whenever we stray from our vow, may that cord of awareness snap us back with gentleness and humor into the space of our practice. Okay, so if you'd like to make this formal commitment with the Sangha to set an intention to daily practice this week, please repeat after me. I, Ethan, with confidence in the benefits of a regular practice of sitting meditation,
with confidence in the benefits of a regular practice of sitting meditation,
do hereby commit for myself and no one else
for myself and no one else
to practicing at least one session of sitting meditation
to practicing at least one session of sitting meditation
for a short or as long a period of time
for a short as long a period of time
as I am willing and able
for
each of the next 7 days.
For each of the next 7 days.
Wonderful. Okay, so thank you all so much. I look forward to really getting into the 12 nidanas. I think it's a really useful framework, and we'll get into it next week. And I think it tells us a lot about actually what we're doing from a karmic perspective when we meditate. And when we do other things too, but especially helps really see the structural function of meditation a little bit more clearly. So looking forward to next week. I hope everybody has a really wonderful week, enjoys the full moon, and thank you all so much for being here live. And it's a real pleasure doing this together. So,
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.